Welcome to the latest episode of WSP's Anticipate Podcast, where we invite experts and thought leaders to share unique perspectives on future trends, hot topics, and anticipate solutions to complex problems. My name is Caroline Parsons, and I'm an executive committee member for WSP in the Middle East, and I look after all things to do with people in our workplaces alongside the other members of our executive committee. The topic of wellness is nothing new. However, the way in which we approach it at an organisation level is continuously evolving. As we celebrate the 10th annual Global Wellness Day, it's essential that leaders across all industries approach any progression towards wellness initiatives with a much more conscious focus. In this episode, we will cover the importance for organisations to adopt top-down approaches to wellness and really weave cultures of wellbeing into everything we do. We will also discuss how we can support to break down some of the stigma often associated with mental health and highlight consequences of burnout and stress in the post-pandemic future. I'm joined today by Victoria Sharpe, who is the Wellness Manager for AMAALA and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's Global Wellness Day Ambassador. Welcome, Victoria. It's a great pleasure to have you as a guest today.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
So we're here today, Victoria, to talk about wellness, and I think it's a very new topic in the sense that you're the first person I've encountered who is a professional wellness expert inside an organisation, which I think is really exciting for where we're going with this topic and this agenda. I think what's also interesting about wellness is it's certainly not new. It's certainly obviously not new to you. It's certainly not new to me or many, many other people. I saw McKinsey suggest it's a 1.5 trillion industry, and the Global Wellness Institute suggests it's actually 4.3 trillion, which is quite a difference, but either way, a significant market and only growing. But why are we talking about it today? I think what has really come into the spotlight, certainly in my profession and the work that I do, is where organisations sit on the wellness journey and how organisations view wellness as part of organisational context, something that business leaders absolutely should be concerned with and not something that's simply outside of the workplace. So with that in mind, I was thinking about yourself, and as I said, I haven't encountered professionals who work inside organisations, and I was really curious to know from you, how have you come along on this journey with organisations? So from your background as a wellness professional, how have you seen kind of hand in hand working with corporations, this progression towards a much more conscious focus on wellness? I'd really love to hear that from you.
It's a really interesting point, and just to give you a bit of background about myself, so I originally left college and started to train as a nurse, and kind of got a bit disillusioned with the medical system at the time and fell almost by accident into the corporate world. But my love of wellness sort of carried through with that, and what I've seen in the corporate world is over the sort of last decade or so, that the corporate world, I think, has always viewed wellness as something that is separate to business, and potentially perhaps be, with the pandemic, what it has highlighted is that it's very much part of the corporate world, of the business world, and because it's with people, and our employees bring their lives into work, and what I've seen certainly in the UK and the Middle East is it's something that the conversation is starting to happen now, and with the sort of awareness of mental health as a result of the pandemic, it's a conversation that is happening in boardrooms, and people realise that it's something that we need to do to support our employees, and it's a conversation from, as I said, from the boardroom right through to line managers and employees. So it becomes part of daily conversation rather than it's something that happens when employees leave work.
Absolutely. I think you've really captured that very well. Even, in my own profession in HR, we obviously come from the roots of personnel and welfare, but it's really come around to a different level of thinking in terms of the strategic focus on wellness and health and care for employees. And I absolutely agree with you. The pandemic has really heightened that and I think in the Middle East, we already come with a level of, let's say, discomfort, for want of any other word, because we've all come here generally as expats. Not all of us, but many of us have come here away from family, away from friends. We've taken that leap into another region, another culture. So the immediate sort of baseline for where we begin is a little discomfort. And then I think with the pandemic particularly, I think in the Middle East, I certainly felt that was heightened for the people that work in our organisation, because we were no longer able to make those family and friendship connections that we'd relied upon, and they were becoming more difficult. So I certainly saw that interest in mental health really accelerated. So the people who wanted to talk about it, who wanted to have information, who wanted support. And I think what it came down to was the organisation, we could cope. Many organisations were able to, with the support of people like yourself and external bodies, we were able to bring in that support, but it did feel like a bolt-on. So I'm really curious, given you're strategically placed inside of AMAALA, how does an organisation like AMAALA approach it less as a bolt-on and more as part of the organisation design?
I think you actually had a really good point there. I think typically, and I'm not saying it shouldn't, but sort of well-being tends to sit within the HR department. And certainly I've seen the sort of evolution over the years that it's always been quite a reactive component. So it tends to be HR tends to get involved when there's a problem with an employee. So if a manager identifies that potentially there's an issue with someone, then it gets referred to HR and HR sort of step in. So what I've seen actually over the last few years is it's much more proactive now. And certainly that's something that AMAALA is doing. We really recognise wellness runs through our DNA, and as an organisation, we recognise that not only do we need to be there for employees if they highlight that there is an issue, but it's about having those policies, those that the training and the education for management to recognise when employees may be, and I don't like to use the word suffering with mental health issues, because I think again that sort of speaks to this stigma around mental health. I think we all have challenges in life, so I tend to say it's just mental health challenges, just like if you have a physical injury, if we twist our ankle, we don't say we're struggling with an ankle sprain. It's the same with mental well-being issues. So I think it's much more around putting policies and procedures and training in place that help to prevent those issues getting, if you like, chronic or problematic in the first place. And again, that really does start from the very top of the organisation. So it's a culture, as opposed to, as you quite rightly said, a bolt-on that suddenly we realise, and as you said, the pandemic has highlighted this, that potentially we've got some employees that are having some personal issues. So we add something onto an HR policy, as opposed to actually this should be in the culture, in the DNA of the organisation to start with.
I think that's a really great point, because it used to be like that in WSP. I won't lie, wellness was part of the HR agenda. We would work with our brokers, and we have wonderful brokers who help us with that. But over the last, I'd say 6 to 12 months, and we were always working alongside our HSE team, but certainly over the last 12 months, I really see that HSE has taken more of a lead role in this, and together we say it's in the sense that health and safety is the number one agenda on everything we do. This fits into the same bucket. It's not something that is different to any other matter of health and safety or fitness for work, or a safety matter that needs to be mitigated by the organisation. And I really saw that step change once we started to kind of position it as a strategic health and safety matter in the same way of all of our health and safety matters. It has really propelled its strategic importance, the conversation, the cultural attention, the investment to it, the drive behind it. And it's not because HR didn't do it, that would be shooting myself in the foot. It was just a recognition, even for myself, that who is best placed to really drive this forward. And the health and safety team have been doing an amazing job of that. And since 2021, it's embedded in their strategic goals to make sure we do actually have a rounded approach to wellness as part of our health and safety, which I do think, to your point, it shouldn't just land upon HR's mat, and it shouldn't necessarily land upon HSE either. It is a part of the whole culture, and it does need that strategic buy-in and leaders insightful, as they are in AMAALA, clearly, to invest in it, invest in wellness and talk about it openly.
And I think that's a really key point, that I think typically and traditionally it has sat within an HR function, but we're certainly seeing that within AMAALA and other Middle Eastern organisations here, and particularly in Saudi, that the health and safety department and risk are sort of having a stake in employee well-being, if I can sort of put it like that. But I think it's key that it, as you said, you have sort of brokers that you work with. And again, I think organisations have always seen it as something that potentially sits, again, outside the organisation. And I think certainly it's really key to have champions within the organization. So not just someone, and I think brokers do a fantastic job, but it's about knowing the organization, and you really need people from within an organization that understand the culture, that have those personal relationships so they can have those conversations. And it's much more, I think, relatable when you're in the organization itself. And also it's about building trust. So certainly as a wellness manager within AMAALA, I'm pretty visible within the organization. So that brings a certain element of trust with it as well, which potentially you don't always have when you have external companies and brokers coming into an organization.
Yeah, I think I can understand exactly your point. Some really good points there. So just thinking about the fundamental gaps we may face. So you talked there about some of the examples of how we bring wellness into our organizations, and the need for trust and the need for really close attention to understanding our own context to make it suitable and a relevant conversation. So I think just thinking about how do we educate organizations who aren't yet as far along the journey as perhaps WSP or AMAALA? How do we educate those organizations on the importance of wellness and the sustainability of human health?
I think it really is about, as you said, education, but also it directly affects the bottom line. I think there's always a perception that wellness or employee well-being is almost an unnecessary cost, or that there isn't a return on investment. But I think the education part is around the more we invest in our employees and the more we give priority to helping our employees thrive, that it has a direct impact on our bottom line. So there is a huge return in investment, and employees are our capital. They affect our productivity, the profitability of an organization. So firstly, I think the importance of making that investment in the first place, and just generally around having those conversations. So again, coming back to weaving wellness through an organization, through the boardroom, right through to how maybe tying into sort of managers' KPIs. So obviously we all have targets that we need to achieve in business, but tying in those well-being sort of KPIs with performance objectives. So looking at a manager's team, not just in terms of what they're producing in terms of sales and productivity, but how are they doing in a well-being context? Are they thriving personally? And that also is measured as part of a performance review for managers and leaders of teams. I think that will go a long way to really starting, if it isn't already in place, to weave that culture of well-being in an organisation.
I love the way you described the weaving of wellness into all elements of the organisation, and it just made me think about sometimes when we, not directly or not deliberately certainly, do the opposite. Actually, we take steps that indirectly push against wellness. Whether it's through drivers or particular metrics or targets that we're driven that will drive the opposite of wellness. I think it's a journey that organizations still really need to go on, to really sit back and say, okay, we want to have a well organization. We want wellness to be at the front of our agenda, but is everything in our organization speaking to that target? Or are there some things that are perhaps in our legacy or in the behaviors of or our culture that kind of, as I say, indirectly, almost unconsciously go against it? I think having that awareness to really challenge ourselves in organizations and just say, well, what's the outcome of this? If I push pressure here, what's the likely outcome going to be? Is it going to support wellness or is it not? And I think we're just starting to learn to ask ourselves a bit more directly, are we really designing organizations that can truly support wellness, as you say, in a way that weaves through all that we do?
You're completely right. And it's, the data, there's been countless studies conducted on this, and the data shows that the healthier, the more mentally well that employees are, the more productive and creative they are, and the more committed, the more engaged. So it's certainly, again, going back maybe sort of 20 years, I was working for an insurance company in the City of London, and I was one of the first people to talk about wellness there. And back then it was seen very much as okay, we'll organise a monthly massage for employees. And it was, again, not really seen as something that benefits the organisation, but more that it just benefits the employee. So it was not really seen as a synergistic relationship, if you like. And what I like and what I'm seeing today is organisations more and more are really understanding that this is an investment in the organisation. Of course, it's an employee benefit, but it's a bigger benefit for the organisation. And I really like the way that organisations are really supporting that. And certainly in AMAALA, that's something that we really recognise, again, from the leadership through to senior managers, that the investment today pays dividends in the future because our employees are taken care of. And I find myself, when I think there's a well-known saying that employees don't leave organisations, they leave their managers. And so it affects everything from staff turnover to things like presenteeism. So when people are in work, they're much more engaged, much more motivated and creative.
No, absolutely. I think you just sort of having me think about one of the other hot topics that is very relevant at the moment is burnout and the consequences from the pandemic, from the change of the working environments that we've all gone through, is how this culture of burnout and how managers are equipped or not equipped to manage burnout, even in themselves, never mind, and whether or not they role model or not behaviours that will support their team. I think also what occurs to me when you were just talking then was what employees expect these days. So you talked about the impact, the business, the positive impacts of lower turnover, better engagement, probably more discretionary effort somewhere along the way, but also just our reputation as employers and people wanting to work for us, wanting to feel that we have an interest in their full wellness and not just on the sections they deliver for the organisation. So I think there's so many pieces that we touch on when it comes to being that employer of choice.
I think the communication aspect as well. And I think for all of us, and I think it's great what you're doing with the podcast. And I think for all of us that have the opportunity to have those conversations that are public facing, I certainly take my responsibility really seriously to talk about my own issues, my own sort of challenges. And I think, in the sort of celebrity world, we have lots of very high profile sports people talking about mental health challenges, but the business world has some work to do in playing catch up in that. And I think it's on all of us to say, actually, sometimes I have bad days and sometimes I've suffered. I think you touched on a point there, that how do managers recognize even that their own sort of mental health challenges, and also for their employees. If you've never suffered with anxiety, how do you know what anxiety looks like? And I'm someone, I've never suffered with anxiety, but through the pandemic, I did, but I didn't recognize it. And this is from someone who's worked in wellness for sort of 3 decades. So for managers to really understand, potentially, recognizing if staff are maybe a bit more irritable than usual, perhaps their timekeeping isn't great, that rather than start sort of going down a disciplinary route, that actually having that training in place, that potentially there may be some mental health challenges going on, and recognizing that, mental health isn't just anxiety and depression. It manifests in lots of different ways for different people.
Absolutely. You reminded me of the mental health first aider training that we did. So we've rolled out mental health first aider training in WSP, and it's really eye opening because it talks about, it's not always the clinically mental health. It's sometimes just, we don't feel great. Things aren't working or flowing in the ways that we would like, and that affects us at work. And having managers notice these things, as opposed to kind of assume it's something that isn't anything to do with work, or it's not a work issue or not a work conversation. So I do think we have some way to go to bring that awareness into managers. And certainly in WSP, we're working on that. We're doing mental health training for all managers to just bring awareness to it. But there's still a step, I think, around, and I'm sure you'd agree, just around the general stigma of mental health. So you were just touching on that in some of your examples. How can we help managers or employees, even just organizations, to move past the stigma, in your experience?
I believe it really comes back to communication again, and making it part of everyday conversation. I think mental health is seen as something separate to almost, we look at sort of well-being, and there's this sort of dark corner of mental health, which again kind of goes towards this sort of stigma. And it's, as you said, it's about saying, sometimes I'm not feeling so great, and it's not that I'm necessarily diagnosed with anxiety or depression, but potentially someone isn't sleeping very well for a prolonged period, which has sort of knock-on effects. And it's potentially managers having those conversations with people. With remote working, for instance, I think it's difficult anyway, but it's potentially more difficult to identify when people are having some mental health challenges. And rather than sort of checking in with employees and asking them what they're working on, it's maybe having a 5-10 minute conversation and just asking how they are. How is life? How are you coping with working from home, for instance? And identifying that it potentially might not be your own mental health challenge, but perhaps your someone in your family circle is having a mental health challenge. So it's sort of looking at that as well. Unless the training, as you said, mental health first aid training, I think is fantastic, and I would love to see that rolled out across organizations, throughout the Middle East. But having those conversations around that it's okay to have those challenges. And with the pandemic, it's really highlighted some of those anxieties that people have around social isolation, and just really keeping those conversations going, again, from the boardroom right through to team leaders.
Absolutely. I think, and so as well, this sincerity of the conversation as well. So we, leaders who, you said earlier, who really champion this, who want to be seen as someone who's championing it, who ask the question, are you okay? And genuinely mean to know the answer, and not afraid. So their own stigma is parked, their own stigma is that they've moved past that themselves. So I think that's a key part of any organization, or any effort in an organization to drive a culture one way or another, is people who are prepared to step in and say, I care about this. This is an issue in our organization that we can do better on, or that we want to do better on. And I think the other thought about wellness in general, so this is, a podcast in celebration of global wellness. And one of the other areas that, again, we don't often talk about is just the preventative nature of all healthcare. So not just mental health, but also health. And I'd be really interested in how you see that in the organizational context as well.
Global Wellness Day is just a fantastic global initiative from the start, and it was started back in 2012 by a really great visionary lady named Belgin Aksoy. And one of the things I love about Global Wellness Day is it has what they call a 7-step manifesto. So it's really easy, if you want to sort of call them life hacks, that everyone can incorporate into their daily lives, regardless of your social background, your economic background. And it's really easy for organizations to align themselves with these 7 steps. So I won't go over all of them, but for example, something like being in bed by 10 p.m. And sleep is something that is really overlooked in the wellness field. I think it's starting to become a lot more prevalent, and people are really paying attention to sleep. And you mentioned earlier the sort of health and safety departments getting involved in employee well-being. And I think if we look at the data around lack of sleep, it really contributes to accidents. And certainly for AMAALA, we have a lot of employees based on site and construction. So sleep's a fundamental pillar of well-being. So that's something that I would really like to see employers talk about in terms of ensuring their employees are educated on the importance of sleep from a risk and health and safety standpoint. We can also talk about eat healthy food is another one of the 7 steps. And again, you talk about sort of preventative lifestyle management, and most of the chronic diseases that we see today are preventable just by making really small changes in our nutrition. So again, I think even for someone who works in the wellness industry, there's so much conflicting information. So most often one of the comments I get from people is it's so confusing what to eat, when to eat, should I fast, should I not fast? So I just say to people, even when it comes to vegetables, eat the rainbow. So make sure that your plate's full of lots of different colours. So in terms of vegetables, just maybe try and see if you can get 5 or 6 different colours on your plate. And again, it kind of brings in a bit of a fun element as well, because it's health. I certainly take my own well-being and well-being of our employees very seriously, but we should make it fun, because then we're much more likely to incorporate these issues in our daily life.
No, absolutely. We just actually in WSP, we just did a couple of step challenges, and there's nothing better than that kind of sense of competition between teams and a little bit of fun. And of course, winning some sort of prize for that. But amazing, people are doing sort of 8 million steps in a team. And you think, wow, that's a serious commitment to moving, and to being mobile and moving around, and making it part of your habits, I think, to the point about whether it's food or sleep or moving and movement. There's a lot to be said sometimes for the very simple things. To your point around, there is a lot of information out there. There's a lot of advice. It's, as I said, it's a trillion dollar industry. So of course there's lots of people trying to tell us what to do. And I think in the organizational context, it's often just saying, well, what are the things we can do? How do we create organizations or workplaces that support it, or have a sense of it's something we want you to do, it's something we're interested in. We've thought about, as I said, the way what food's available in our canteen. We've thought about where our offices are located, so that there's opportunity to take a step outside. I think those, again, coming back to what we said earlier about the design of organizations, that weaving wellness into everything, whether it's the physical or mental health, is something that all organizations can take steps towards. Today, if they just really sit down and think about how ingrained in my organization is this topic, not just are we talking about it, but have we designed for it as well, which of course is what WSP engineers do in their everyday. So yeah, it's really interesting. And I think one of the challenges I've seen, and I wonder if you've shared this as well, is it's not so much the stigma that we talked about with mental health, but even there's a stigma of just going for a checkup. Many organizations offer these preventative wellness checkups, and people don't go. And I've often said, it's available. What would stop you from going? And there's a fear factor of that as well, which, whether that's stigma or genuinely it's I'd rather not know. I've particularly found that more prevalent in the Middle East and some of the cultures we have in the Middle East than I would say it would have been in the UK when I was there. Do you have any experience of that?
I do, and I think you're completely right. And I really like to use the analogy of, most of us have cars and we drive, and we don't think twice about, we know the annual service is coming up, or the 20,000 kilometers service, and it's just automatic. We know that for our vehicles to run efficiently, we take them in for service. And in a very sort of mercenary way, we can look at our bodies and our well-being as that. It's literally we're looking after our bodies, after our well-being, and the data also shows that even if there are some health issues that are identified in these checkups, the earlier we find things, the much better chance we have of a really good outcome. And again, I think we come back to this culture of well-being. If rather than going to seeing a medical intervention or seeing a health practitioner, as we only go to see them when something's wrong. I think even in the medical and the wellness community, it's about having those interactions with health professionals from a preventative standpoint, rather than I'm not feeling very well, so therefore I need to go and see my doctor. It's like I'm actually feeling good. How do I feel better? And having those conversations, rather than I'm not sleeping very well, so let's go and speak to the doctor, or I've got a low mood. It's actually, I feel good, but maybe how can I increase my physical activity? How can I incorporate a different nutrition plan? So having those conversations, rather than when there's leaving it until there's something wrong, or something's not working right.
I think we talked earlier about champions in organizations when it comes to mental health and flying that wellness flag. And I do think it also covers the physical health as well, and people getting teams together to do activities together, to share, to compete, because ultimately we tend to do more when we think someone is watching, or when we think there's a sort of team element to it. So there's so many opportunities that we can keep it fun and not make it too heavy handed on anybody, but we do need to make a conscious effort. And I just say, in all the things we've talked about in today's podcast, I mean, that's the one thing that really strikes me the most, is it does require a conscious effort on behalf of an organisation and its leaders to say, we want to go in this direction. We believe in wellness. We believe that having a healthy workforce is more sustainable. It does impact our bottom line, to the point you made, Victoria. But it requires a conscious effort. And just to bring the podcast to a close, I'd really love to hear from you. What would be the steps you would give to any leaders listening to this podcast and wondering, how do I go forward with this? How do I make progress?
You're completely right. I think it's, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, that wellness and certainly corporate wellness needs to move away from almost that tick box exercise. And I think there's a lot to be said about removing barriers to wellness as well. So apart from having the HR policies, health and safety policies and procedures in place to support employee well-being, but it's also removing those barriers. So something, for example, if tobacco use is discouraged, then the environment needs to support that. And as you also touched on, if we want our employees to eat better, for their nutrition to be healthier, then we need to make sure that in our breakout areas, in our canteens, that we have opportunities to make healthy food choices. In terms of movement, there's I love walking meetings, and that's something that I try to encourage within AMAALA. And certainly lots of people now have, if they're having their one-to-ones, that taking a 10-15 minute walk. And obviously we're based in the Middle East. Sometimes in terms of the temperature and humidity, it's not practical, but having environments where you can just walk with someone for 10 to 15 minutes to have those catch-up times. So again, speaking to the weaving wellness through all aspects of the culture of the organisation really helps to get that organisational wellness lens off the ground.
Great. I love those suggestions. Really wonderful suggestions that we can all kind of do something about very easily, actually, which is very helpful. So I'd just like to say, Victoria, I just want to say thank you for your time. I wish you and AMAALA a very successful Wellness Day ahead, and with all of your work and great investments in the wellness journey of your people and your organisation. Thank you so much. It's been a really enjoyable conversation for me.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure joining you. Thank you.